share about your career?
My career?
Yeah.
Sure. Well, I was educated in Dublin Belvedere College by the Jesuits, and I went to UCD to become a Bachelor of Commerce. And then I joined my father and my two older brothers in the accountancy world and qualified as a chartered accountant, where I spent many years working in a firm which was originally called Kennedy Crowley, and then Stokes Kennedy Crowley, and now KPMG. And I decided in 1990 or thereabouts that I kind of had enough of that, because I specialised in insolvency work, and that was pretty demanding, and I really was getting a bit tired and needed a change. So I took a risk and retired from KPMG and did a number of other things, subsequently, some of which I'm still doing.
Okay. And tell me about we might chat on the insolvency work that you were doing.
Yeah.
Because you did that for a substantial, quite a long period of time. Can you talk me through what your role was and what you were exactly doing?
What
your role was? What did that involve? What you were doing in that role?
Oh, well, it was a very powerful role, want of a better word, in that I became entirely responsible for every action that the insolvent company took, and I was personally liable for all the purchases if the company didn't pay them. So it was very demanding, and of course the big issue were the employees, who many of whom would stand to lose their careers and become unemployed for the rest of their time, because very often the insolvency occurred because of the business failure. It wasn't necessarily mismanagement or anything else, it was just the actual business had failed. For example, there used to be tyres made in a company called Ferenca in Limerick, and these tyres were radial tyres, and they were very upmarket. But then they found that all tyres became radial tyres, so their special expertise was no longer required. So the factory had to shut down.
Okay.
So that's what I mean by business failure.
And that's a very challenging reality.
Yeah.
And when you're dealing with lives and you're dealing with people, and so what were your engagement steps? What did you try to do to make a difference?
Well, first of all, to examine the problem as acutely as one could, to see were there hopes of survival, not necessarily under the present ownership, but hopes of survival with an acquisition by somebody else at a fairly cheap price, because the going concern value was gone, and someone was talking about the knockdown value. So you could pick up, if you had the right skills backing you as a purchaser, you could pick up a business which could be turned around and brought back into profitability, and therefore brought back the employees, keep them at work. And the second thing one did was to talk to the employees as much as possible, because this is one of the worst, if not the worst moment in their lives. They had lost their jobs, they were about to lose their jobs, a real prospect of losing their jobs, and none would replace it probably. So one had to bear that very much in mind and to keep talking with them and explaining the realities of life to them. Not that they were unaware of them, but and bringing them into your confidence to the extent one could as to what you were trying to do to deal with the problems.
And what was the value of engaging honestly with the employees about the reality? What was the impact of dealing with that head on?
Well, I think first of all, the employees deserved it because they had spent, some of them, many, many years working in this organisation and being a very important part of the organisation, and they deserved to be told, to the extent we could tell them the facts of the situation and what I was planning to do. So that was one of the important reasons, and to keep them abreast and keep their self-respect.
So a pig factory that you were working with?
Indeed, that was in the north of Ireland, and there was 14,000 pigs was the main business there. But there were other companies in the group, and one was making pyjamas. And the mixture of pyjamas and pigs was a curious one. The pigs never wore any pyjamas. But the pyjamas were made and sold in Dublin and other places. And the reason that they set up a pyjama factory was to employ the females of the workforce, so that the men would have some female company and get married and have families and keep the whole townland going. So it was a very good reason. But the reason they chose pyjamas specifically was because pyjamas are the one garment that people wear which don't have to fit.
What's kind of interesting about that, in these current times when we're looking at employee needs and things like that? What do you have anything from that perspective to comment?
Well, not really, because it was a very hostile situation.
Okay.
And I was greeted when I arrived there first. On the first day, I was greeted by the whole town out to meet me, see who this lunatic from Dublin was. And I was not let into the premises. In fact, the premises was up a laneway, and there was a huge posse of Gardaí ready to escort me up the laneway, which was lined by the angry townsfolk. So I said, no, I won't do that. So I'll go up on my own. So they said to me, well, we'd have to ring the Minister for Justice, Jim Mitchell, the late Jim Mitchell was his name. And he said that you're making a very risky decision. But I said, it's the only way I can handle this. I can't go around all this time surrounded by policemen. I have to be accepted on my own or not at all. So fortunately, apart from being thrown a few missiles at me on the way up the laneway, nothing happened, but I was not let in. So I drove home and came back several further times and eventually was let in. And the pigs were happy.
What was the end result with that organisation? Was it?
Sorry?
What was the end result for that organisation? Were you able...
It still exists.
Okay.
And the pigs are still...
Okay. And what did you do to turn that around? Because there's a lot of leadership ingredients or elements or in that story, Laurence. So what if you were to analyse it from a leadership analysis perspective, what were the critical things that you did, do you feel, that allowed for you to turn around that organisation?
Well, speaking more generally, I think the critical thing that one has to do is to identify the issues which are causing problems. And you can only get such identification by talking to people and talking to second and third line management as well as the top management. And you build up a picture of what needs to be changed, what needs to be done. And you share that. I would always share that view with the management, so as to get their buy-in to it. Because while they mightn't agree with everything, it was very important that they agreed with the majority of what one was proposing. And of course, keeping them abreast of possible new owners. In other words, getting them involved at a level they probably hadn't been involved before. Because they might well have been kept in the dark all this time. And because management don't like to admit failure. And that's very understandable.
And what was the power, did you see, of listening to the staff and then including them and updating them? What was the impact for everyone?
It was usually very positive. Having got over the initial shock of the receivership happening and the constant worry of their losing their jobs, having got accustomed to that, so to speak, it was usually very positive and very helpful. And so that the overall plan that would emerge would not be my plan, it would be a joint plan of everybody involved.
I'm thinking of a moment you shared with me before about when you went to the Opera House with Mela in Waterford, when in your time as...
Sorry?
When you went to the Opera House in Waterford.
Oh, in Wexford.
Or in Wexford, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Will you tell me about that? Because you had a little bit of fear initially.
Yeah.
Around that.
Well, it was really the sometime after the receivership had finished in Wexford, and I had sold the business to another purchaser, and I was at Mass in Rose Street Church, and Mela was in the hotel because she couldn't walk. So I was at Mass and came out of the Mass, and I was surrounded by a group of men who literally appeared from nowhere. And they said to me, this is a peaceful mission we're on with you. If you'll come with us quietly, we want you to meet somebody. So we walked for about 20 minutes in silence, which is a bit frightening. I'd never seen any of these people before. And we walked down to a house, and the door was opened, and a woman came out with a little baby in her arms. And she said to me, she said, this is a young child who was born during the receivership. And she said, you were so kind to all of us that we decided to call him after you, Laurence. So I thought that was a very nice gesture.
Wonderful. And have you ever met Laurence since?
No, I haven't met him since.
Yeah, that is a lovely story. And Laurence, what was it that you did that was so kind? Because that's quite a touching gesture.
Well, I think it was the fact that I was honest with them.
Yeah.
And spoke to them and listened to them. I think it was that.
Wow.
Rather than anything else.
Yeah. And that kind of brings me on to, you were doing quite long hours when you were working.
Yeah.
In the insolvency, but you've shared with me before about the importance of family.
Yeah.
And can you talk to me a little about that?
Yeah. I think it is hugely important that the family are involved in a sense in the job you're doing. Your husband or your wife or whoever it is, and indeed to some extent your children, that they're conscious of the organisation you work for and of the time you're putting into it and of the efforts you're making, working at weekends and whatever you need to do. So that's a very important element of the of this.
And but in terms of, you shared how you would come home at 5 for Jonathan and Mela.
Yeah.
And now when you look at doing that, because that would be quite unusual now in today's environment.
Yeah.
What's the importance for you now that you did that, even though you were working incredibly hard, but you managed to do that?
Yeah, but I would come home but be available when Jonathan had gone to bed.
Yeah, yeah.
So that people could come out to my house and we could continue the business we were doing. I think it was very important, particularly for Jonathan, because his mother was away in most of that time in hospital. He wasn't allowed to go to see her for some very strange reason. So he would have been abandoned if I wasn't. I had a carer for him, of course, but he would have been virtually abandoned if I didn't make that a rule.
And how do you feel about, prioritising that time with Jonathan for those few hours every evening before he went to bed? How do you feel about that now and where you are now in your life?
I feel good about it. I think he feels good about it too.
Yeah. and I suppose it's beautiful that he's living with you now as well.
Yeah.
And his family.
Yeah.
Tell me about Mela.
Yeah. Well, she had a horse riding accident in her late 30s, middle 30s, which caused brain damage. And she was a couple of months in Beaumont Hospital in Dublin, where the brain unit was. It's now moved. And then she was in the rehab, Rochester Avenue, for about a year. And gradually began to recover some of her faculties. She could never walk again, but she could speak reasonably well. And she was paralysed down one side. But she could manage. She was a very brave, very courageous person. She died about 3 or 4 years ago. And it was a great experience having her home with me and with Jonathan.
And I remember you had to make a very big choice, or you made a very big decision when the doctor shared about Mela's faith or reality.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that and
the
decision you made?
Yeah. Well, in the Richmond Hospital, the brain surgeons there, one of them said to me one day, I used to call in to see him regularly when I was up there. He said, I've got very bad news for you. And I said to him, what could this be? He said, your wife is going to live. So I was pretty stunned at the way he put that to me. But he said, you should put her in a home when she's fit enough to leave here. But I went up to the Phoenix Park and sat there for a while and decided that I would not put her into a home, that would be worse than the worst. So I decided to bring her home, and everything worked out well from there on in.
have you really missed? It's been very hard. How has it been since Mela has passed?
It hasn't been easy, but a lot of good things come out of bad situations.
And when you'd come home from work, you know, for 40 years, she was your loyal friend that would listen and help you. Can you talk to me a little about the gift of Mela's presence for the last 40 years?
Well, that's a big question.
Yeah.
She was always very calm and very considerate, and a good listener. When I would tell her all about my problems, and a good friend.
And how do you think that helped you in your work? Because you had quite demanding work and career.
It kept me calm. I think it was the major product of it.
Yeah, yeah.
And once you talk things over, even if Mela couldn't understand half the things I was saying to her, it helped me greatly to have another think about it, whatever particular issue was bothering me at the time.
And do you feel, I remember once when you were, can you share with me about the relationship between the chairman and the CEO? What's that relationship?
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Well, I think it's an extremely important relationship, because the CEO is very often, but it doesn't matter whether it's true or not, but very often has been with the company for some years. And then the CEO is appointed CEO, and it becomes isolated to quite an extent from his former equals. He's now the boss, and he needs somebody to talk to and to bounce problems off, and that's where the chairman, I believe, plays a vital role in working with the CEO in the background. Not the CEO is the CEO, and the chairman is the chairman, but together in the background they can be hugely helpful to each other, and particularly the chairman can be hugely helpful to the CEO in a way which doesn't compromise either of them, because the chairman is non-executive normally, so there's no clash between the roles of the two of them.
I remember before when you talked about it, you talked about being the loyal friend, the loyal listener, and the loyal friend.
Yeah.
The chairman would be to the CEO.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of Mela being that to you.
Yeah.
In a way, she was a great teacher.
Yeah.
In showing us, and in a way, that's what you have been to me. You know, over the years, has been a loyal friend and a listener.
Yeah.
And do you think that there's elements of that leaders need to apply across their organizations? If leaders were to take that approach with all managers or employees, what would your opinion be on that?
I do think they need to take that approach, because that's where good ideas come from. That's where trust comes from. That's where confidence in each other comes from. And I strongly believe that loyal friends and loyal colleagues are a critical element in any business situation.
And Laurence, in the work we've been doing, I've been witnessing a lot of broken trust
Of
for leaders, a lot of leadership teams across different enterprises, across different sectors, struggling with trust. There's a lack of trust within the team. Have you any advice on how to approach it when there's a lack of trust within a team?
It's very difficult, but it's absolutely critical that something is done about it. And I couldn't give you any particular remedy, but discussing it is, I think, of paramount importance. And even though it's awkward and could be misconstrued, it's lack of trust is a cancer in an organisation, and it's got to be treated, or else it'll kill the organisation.
So, for a leader, there's a couple of brilliant leaders at the moment, and what I've been witnessing is power plays and a lack of respect for the leader and wanting the leader's position.
Yeah.
So there's someone within the leadership team undermining the leader
Yeah.
because they want the slot. How should the leader, what would be your suggestions for the leader to deal with that situation? How should the leader, the top leader, deal with that situation?
Well, he's got to get stuck into it and really find out, is it the whose fault it is and what's the cause of it. And it's very difficult, but it's essential.
Okay. Which is very similar, which is exactly what you're talking about, what you had to do in the insolvency situations.
Yeah.
It's the same formula.
It is.
But what you were doing was at a larger scale.
Yeah.
And I recall you previously saying to me, you have to go to the top, if there's another boss or that you need to go and get support as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's that idea of dealing with it head on, not running away from it, avoiding it.
Can't do that.
Yeah. And what's the consequence of avoiding it?
Of avoiding it? A very poor performance eventually in the organisation, because it can have repercussions throughout the whole organisation. If that kind of atmosphere is around, and other people may well try to copy it. So it's very important to be rooted out.
And I see a lot of leaders having fear to take it on, or kind of shying away.
I understand it.
Yeah.
It's very difficult, but it has to be for the individual's sake and for the organisation's sake. You have to cut that out.
So it's like the leadership's job is to get over their own needs and look at the bigger picture nearly. Yeah. You've been well acknowledged for the difference and the change and the work you did with building Smurfit Business School. Would you mind sharing us about your role in Smurfit?
When I joined the university, there was the main focus in business was at the undergraduate level, the BCom in particular, and there were a few courses kind of tacked on for example, the MBA was started there, and a few other courses, but there was no coherent graduate school. So Paddy Masterson, who was the president of UCD, decided that this was a thing he needed to see, a coherent graduate school. So he approached Michael Smurfit, who came up with a significant sum of money, and the school was created. The idea of the school was now taking shape. So he decided he needed an outsider to help with that. And I met him on one occasion, and anyway, we got on well together. I'd known him for years. So I agreed to join the school because that was the time I was leaving KPMG. So the timing couldn't have been better. I didn't really know much about academic work or how you run a business school. So I decided I would listen for about the first year. And I set up a few committees, and we worked together, talked together, and they did most of the talking and I did most of the listening. They listened to, and I think that was an important way of doing it because they were nervous of me, and I was nervous of them. But they thought they didn't know what I was supposed to do, and maybe it hadn't been explained very well to them. But we got on together well, and gradually began to take shape. But the important thing I did was to listen, and then agree jointly a course of action.
Mm. Again, the same formula
you
did with the receivership.
Yeah.
So you were a man ahead of your time, because we are now, the leadership courses are trying to teach and show that it's around harnessing the power of the collective, and that it's collective listening. So you did the case studies a couple of years ago. What would you have any suggestion or advice to leaders in the current climate? You know, what would you like to say to them?
Well, I think change is the most extraordinary thing they're going to have to deal with. I mean, one has to always deal with change. If you look around at the jobs that people have today, how many of those actual jobs existed 20 years ago? Not that many of them. And with technology and artificial intelligence and all these kind of things booming around us, change is going to get faster and faster. So you've got to be very adaptable to change, and not oppose it, welcome it, cautiously welcome it, but don't try to stop it because you won't succeed. So that's the main point I would make to them.
It's interesting because talking about artificial intelligence and automation, you know,
Indeed.
It's a critical issue leaders are faced with currently, and there's an opportunity with automation to extract the value or build on it and enhance the employee experience. Would you like to speak to that, or what would your thoughts be?
Yeah, well, I think it's they're not alternatives. You've got to do some of each. You have to enhance the value, but you also must reward shareholders and obviously employees. So it's not a question of either or, it's a question of a piece of each.
So you can make sure it's viable and it's sustainable
on
both levels.
Yeah.
You have been mentoring and supporting me for about 5 years now.
Right.
And
been a pleasure.
Just a little woman from Cork. And why have you done that, and why is it important for someone of your level to be mentoring someone like me? Why do you do that?
Well, I think that you're a remarkable person. I think what you're doing and what you're proceeding well with is very important in life. To put jobs and put employees in their respective places and encourage them and help them, to perform better and have a more balanced life. Because the really good employee can't be spending their entire life rushing around, keeping task after task, being overwhelmed by them. They must, to be really successful, you need balance between life, between family, between social activities, charitable and whatever, as well as your job.
So you would really endorse the essence of the work that
I do.
And that reminds me, when you shifted from insolvency, you reduced your hours substantially. Your hours halved. Is that right? Maybe that it went to about a 35, 40-hour week when you moved into more the non-executive roles.
Well, it doesn't always need to be as dramatic as that. And I think that emphasising points like that make employers suspicious of the whole concept that this is going to cost huge amounts of money. And it's more about flexibility than hours. That, in other words, that you spend several hours working at home with the family around you, rather than shorter total time engaged in the job.
Which is what you managed to do. You would come home, see Jonathan, and then be able to be available again. Yeah. Did you feel there was value in building in time for reflection? I do. And another thing that if you think about the longevity of life, which we're currently, thankfully, all experiencing, that, in my view, has the potential to become a real problem. Because if you're retiring at 65 and you're going to live to be 105, what are you going to do for the 40 years? Because you've been spending your time initially on education and then on in the workplace. And you haven't been taught how to create meaningful activities for the final 40 years of your life. You're reminding me of something. When I was setting up the advisory board initially 5 years ago, one leader said to me, make sure you don't get anyone old on the board. And I remember thinking how short-sighted it was.
Yeah.
And it's been the opposite. It's been the older people I have found the crossmix has been where the value has been.
Yeah.
Because people are bringing different pieces of wisdom and experience, and where there's been such a value with that crossmix. Do you want to talk about that a little? What would your thoughts be?
Yeah, I think it is very valuable, and both segments of the population are inclined to dismiss each other. One saying, "Well, he's too young to know anything about anything," and the other saying, "This is a boring old fart, who's failed in what he tried to do or whatever." Whereas it's the combination which is critical. The enthusiasm of youth matched by the experience of the older person. In my book is a very valuable combination.
And what would your message or your advice be, or your ask to leaders in looking at this? What do you think they could do?
I think they must adopt that kind of philosophy and work to achieve it. It'll take some time, but work steadily to achieve it. Have a mixture of all kinds of people, particularly women in the workplace.
in terms of mentoring, an older person mentoring a younger person, and for older people to do that more, or more people with more experience. What would you say about that? Why should they do that?
Older people.
Like, you've mentored me.
Right.
And you do that. Why do you mentor younger people?
Because I think you see in the person a worthwhile person, and you see what they're trying to do as being very worthwhile also. So it's that kind of...
To nurture the next generation.
Yeah.
So with the dialogue process, it's all about listening to the people and then helping leaders to make informed decisions after listening.
Right.
Why would you endorse that process? Why does that process work, do you believe? That idea, that concept?
Well, I think because the leader is involved in the whole process, and it's partly his process or her process when they take it away. So they have ownership of what they're going to implement.
The staff do, that they're all involved.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And Laurence, we're hoping to do a dialogue, using the dialogue process on the housing crisis in Cork, and we're hoping to look at creative solutions.
Yeah.
Which could be piloted, some ideas piloted in Cork and implemented elsewhere then. What would you say to the leaders, or what's your comments and opinion on what's happening around housing currently in Ireland?
Well, I think the present situation is impossible and desperately sad and causing great pain and distress. So I think any new thinking is very important, because it's going to take years to solve the current problem with the current thinking. And some interim solutions or some entirely new solutions are necessary to get people off the streets.
What would you say to your younger self?
What would I say?
Mm-hmm.
I'd say you did some things right. You didn't do everything right. But at least you tried. I think they're the kind of things I say to myself.
Yeah, so keep trying.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Keep trying. Never give up.
And Laurence, one of the things that I love about you is your curiosity. You're always interested.
Yeah.
You know, why is that important?
Well, I think if you're not curious, you'll settle for the status quo. Mm. And the status quo is not the right place to be. Mm. I mean, I'm not suggesting revolutions now or anything, but accepting things like the homelessness crisis is not appropriate. So you must be curious to see how you can change that.
What I've witnessed with you is a real kindness and an integrity. Whenever your name comes up, people use the word integrity. Can you talk about what integrity means? What is integrity in your mind?
Integrity. Well, I think essentially it's doing the right thing, no matter how awkward that can be, and not to compromise on matters of principle, but to say, I happen to believe that this is the right thing to do in these circumstances, and I'm going to do it. Even though there are more attractive routes, if you're not as so much overawed by integrity.
And who taught you integrity? Where did that value come from?
I think my father. He was very strong in the integrity business.
Okay. And now where you're sitting, what is the impact of living by that principle? What is the impact now when you look at some very big decisions that you made in your life? You know, certainly probably the biggest was around Mela.
Yeah.
That you overruled, you know, an expert.
Yeah.
You know, so what does that mean for your heart now?
Well, it certainly is a nice thing to reflect on.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it was, you know, she believed in it also.
If you were starting work again, would you do anything different?
If I was starting
Work again, if you were starting out?
I don't think so. No, I was very, very fortunate to be given the opportunities I was given. And I don't think I would change much.
You've just reminded me of one piece. You shared with me previously around that there was a deeper sense of purpose to doing the work around the receivership.
To it?
To doing the work with the around the insolvency and the receivership. Right. Will you talk about that? Can you talk about that? Do you know what I'm talking about?
No.
In terms of you cared so much about doing the right thing.
Yeah.
That you felt a calling to do it.
Yeah.
You know, that this was important work to really help people.
Very important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And putting the people first, were the people...
Well, putting them equally first.
Yeah.
There are a number of priorities that have to be observed and achieved.
Yeah.
And of course the creditors are very important in the equation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because sometimes they can be very damaged themselves.
Yes.
So there's a lot of priorities.
A lot of priorities and juggling that. And is there anything else you'd like to say?
No, except to thank you for listening to me and to thank you for putting up with me and trying to help you and assist you to achieve your results.
Oh, thank you, Laurence.